Welcome to the First Time Facilitator podcast. Whether you're a first-time facilitator or a seasoned pro, listen in for tips and tricks to make a bigger impact at the next workshop you deliver. And now, your host. She used to play the tuba in school, Leanne Hughes.
Hello and welcome to the show. I'm your host, Leanne Hughes, and I'm here to help you develop and deliver workshops that kill. Now, this episode is sponsored by my Instagram account at Leanne Hughes. So you can follow me on there for all travel and workshop and first-time facilitator updates. I actually do a lot on Instagram stories. In fact, recently this month, last month, the month of May, I did a video a day challenge on Instagram stories. So every single day in May, I recorded a video about something I'd learnt, something I was thinking about, and I posted it on stories, and I've got a few highlights there. So you can play along, and I'd love to interact with you on there. I think Instagram's just wonderful. So again, that is over at Leanne Hughes. Now, I'm recording this podcast facing a little bit of jet lag. I've just returned from a trip to the USA where I had the most amazing time at the Gallup Clifton Strengths Conference. As always, the information at conferences is good, but it's really the connections that well and truly stand out. So I'll be dedicating an episode to share what I learnt and the process that my co-facilitator, Adam Musto, and I sort of used when we delivered our breakout session. The coolest part about that was that Adam and I met through the podcast. So we'll be getting Adam on the line. We'll be sort of debriefing that and also sharing highlights from the conference. And if you're a strengths geek, definitely stay tuned into that one. And if you're listening in because you heard about this podcast from the conference, it's so good to have you here and welcome. And of course, if you're an existing listener, thanks so much for tuning in to another weekly show. So today's guest is Dr Ian Plowman, and he's also from Brisbane, Australia. I met Ian during Dr Cathryn, Lloyd and Andrew Ricson's workshop on the Story Cookbook. That was held in Brisbane, I think back in April. Now, after a very brief conversation with him during the workshop, I just knew I had to have him on the show. As you'll hear, he's just tremendously smart. But he also does an incredible job of keeping it real and practical, particularly when sharing workshop insights in this interview. Ian has created something called Cooperative Conversations, and this is a unique suite of skills that enables any group to halve their meeting times while doubling fun, wisdom, and commitment. How good is that? I wish all of my meetings had been halved when I worked in corporate. Not a lie. I really do. And that he brings fun in is even better. Ian says that Cooperative Conversations is the culmination of much of what he's learned from his studies and his clients. He has over 30 years experience as an organisational psychologist, as well as demonstrated history of working with boards, management teams, committees, conferences, industries and communities. You know what the best thing about this is? He didn't really start his career in organisational psych until he hit his 30s. Very inspiring. So Ian is a strong human resources professional who is skilled in everything ranging from facilitation to executive development, strategic planning to organisational development, social research, innovation, and everything in between. He also holds a PhD in management psychology, investigating the factors underpinning innovation in organisational settings. That's so relevant for what we're going through right now, isn't it? Now, in this episode, he wins the most unique prop ever used in a workshop award. I honestly didn't know where he was going with the story, but the prop combined with the message that he shares is so X factor and memorable. So I definitely recommend listening out for it. Remember, if you'd like to stay in touch with the show when the conversation is over, join our free community on Facebook called The Flip Chart. Just go onto Flipchart and search for that, or you can also find the link in the show notes. You can also sign up to the monthly newsletter of the same name on the First Time Facilitator website at firsttimefacilitator.com. So where do you find the show notes? Well, they're at firsttimefacilitator.com/episode 70. The big 70. Wow. Okay, now onto the show. I would like to welcome to the First Time Facilitator podcast, Ian Plowman. Ian, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Leanne. I'm pleased to be here.
I had to get you on the show after meeting you at the Story Cookbook. We were workshopping it one weekend in Brisbane and we had a great conversation. And I was like, Ian, give me your card. I'm getting you on the show. So just to start, I was wondering if you could share with our listeners a bit about who you are, about your career pivots that led you to starting your company, Cooperative Conversations.
Okay. Well, it came about by accident. I spent first third of my life in finance and commerce, decided I didn't like that, took myself back to school at age 35. I spent 5 years full-time as a student doing psychology, emerged from that and found myself lecturing adults in TAFE and universities. And what I discovered out of doing that was that it was a good fit. The students seemed to enjoy what I offered them and I thrived on their response to that. So it became a bit addictive. And so I thought, okay, there's a possible, career here because I was then 40 and wondering what the hell I was going to do with my life, despite the fact that I had a few pieces of paper. I needed to find something that was going to give me joy as well as income. And I had a sense of that once I started teaching. And then I realized that what teaching was all about was, in fact, facilitating other people's learning. And what I began to thrive on was the people's eyes lighting up as ideas and pennies started to drop for them, as thoughts started to dwell for them, and they started to develop a love of learning that manifested itself in quite a number of my students saying, oh, I want to do more of this. I'm going to go off and do a master's, or I'm going to go off and do a PhD, etc. So that was validation for the fact that I was able to spark something in them.
Fantastic. I just want to take this back to age of 35. So I'm 35 right now.
Yeah. Actually,
really funny. The fact that you were very brave and you went to university for 4 years. I've got so many friends that say, oh, look, I'm not happy in what I'm doing, but, I've got to keep doing it. And they're 35. So what do you have to say to them?
Go with your gut. I mean, I had a wife and 2 children who were then toddlers at that stage with no income, and it was a fairly brave move. I pushed a lawnmower and did people's gardens one day a week to keep body and soul together until I won a scholarship that made it a little bit easier. Yeah, so I had 5 years of no employment, yet I discovered that for me, having dabbled with a variety of different courses, from economics to accounting to sociology to psychology, that the ones that lit me up were those that were about people. And so that became my career.
Fantastic. And I really like as well, you talked about that moment when you see the people in your room, when the pennies drop for them and you see their eyes light up and they understand it. That's also a reason and what really drives me as well. Can you share with our listeners what kind of topics and workshops you run these days?
Oh, these days, my favourite topic is Cooperative Conversations. I'll go back one step. I did a PhD as part of my long academic journey, and my PhD question was, why are most organisations incompetent, don't know, and don't care? That was the PhD question. Having worked in private sector, public sector and universities over the previous 30 years and recognising that all of them, at least the majority of them, were crazy places to work in and many of them quite toxic. And so I was interested to know whether academia, study, research could tell me why this was occurring. And so I used evolutionary psychology as the lens to understand why most organisations are incompetent, don't know and don't care. And that's a subject for a different conversation. But the end result of that was quite depressing because it helps me understand how people are likely to behave in certain circumstances. And then I went looking for an antidote to that. And the antidote is Cooperative Conversations, which is my particular passion. And Cooperative Conversations is a suite of tools to enable any group of people to have really constructive dialogue in a highly efficient, enjoyable, equitable fashion.
Wow.
It's completely counterintuitive because the most constructive way a group of people can have a conversation, a formal conversation, not just social chit-chat, but let's say strategic planning, team building, conflict resolution, even executive meetings, board meetings, the most constructive way a group of people can have a conversation is provided they do not talk to each other. Now, that sounds ridiculous.
Yeah, that sounds counterintuitive.
It is counterintuitive. And the easiest way for me to position that for you and your listeners is to ask you some silly questions. that relate to the PhD. In our world at large, in public settings, governments, corporates, churches even, who has more influence over the big decisions, men or women?
Men.
Okay. Putting aside gender altogether, who has more influence in the big decisions, people that are senior or junior?
Senior, without a doubt.
Quiet or dominant?
Dominant.
Well-known or unknown?
Well-known.
Handsome or plain?
Oh, handsome.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Okay.
Taller or shorter?
Taller.
Deep voice or high voice?
Deep voice.
Whenever we get a group of people together, we are unconsciously hardwired to defer to all of those characteristics, and they sway the direction of the decision. Which of those characteristics has any necessary connection to wisdom?
None.
None, absolutely. So a cooperative conversations is a way of avoiding those unconscious things happening and having people, rather than talk to each other, have them talk only to the topic. So that means that anything that you say, and imagine the topic as being a symbol in the middle of the table, right? So people are talking to this symbol in the middle of the table, which is the question or the subject matter we're here to talk about. And anything you say, no one else responds to. Whether they agree or disagree, they don't respond to it. Anything that I say, exactly the same. So we are layer after layer of good ideas in the middle of the table, regardless who offers them. And before very long, the wisdom emerges from the top of that pile with no one knowing who suggested it and nobody caring.
Yeah.
It's fantastic, and it's completely counterintuitive.
And it's something completely new that I hadn't heard of, an approach that was completely foreign to me. When you do facilitate this, I imagine, how do you sort of set it up? Because I imagine everyone's so used to going in there, facing each other, talking to each other. You must lay some pretty hard ground rules for this to work.
Indeed. Let me ask you a silly question. If you were driving this morning in your motor vehicle and you got pulled up by a policeman and the policeman said, "Excuse me, madam, do you realise you've just violated the Monday rule? That'll be $250, thanks." And you say, "What's the Monday rule?" And they say, "Never you mind, that'll be $250, thanks." How do you feel?
Frustrated.
Okay. Imagine a similar scenario. You're driving to work and you get pulled up by a policeman. He says, "Excuse me, madam, do you realise you've just been clocked at 45 through a 40-kilometre school zone? That'll be $250, thanks." Now how do you feel?
Frustrated, but I understand why I've been booked. Yeah.
That is the difference. In the one case, there are some guidelines that are non-personal. They were written long before you started to drive a car. So you're not being targeted personally by those ground rules. Let me ask you another silly question. What's the difference between a draft and a breeze in terms of air movement?
Draft and a breeze. I think a draft is a little bit more intense.
Which would you prefer?
A breeze.
Yes. A breeze is what you get when you open the window. And a draft is what you get when some other bastard opens the window. What's the relevance of that to our conversation? If a group of people want to improve their behaviour and the quality of their conversations, then they need to generate their own rules because then they'll own them.
Yeah, having a sense of autonomy and control over the series of events.
And the right to change them subject to their own experiences. And the origin of Cooperative Conversations came about because I facilitated 3 days of strategic planning for a community sitting around a very large silky oak table, 25 dedicated people, 3 days of toing and froing. And they all thought they'd worked very hard, and I thought they'd worked very hard. But on the Monday, when I was waiting to catch the little plane out of that community, I reflected upon how well I thought it had worked. What were all the characteristics of meetings that seemed to be detrimental to their effective outcomes? And what would the opposite look like? And that's all anybody ever needs to do. So any group of people, any of your listeners, just say to their team, "Hey, team, can we have a conversation about how we might work together more effectively?" And if the answer to that is yes, get them to brainstorm all the things they don't want to have happen and then create the opposite.
Yes, it's actually easier. I know that I've done some presentation workshops, and I think when I first started doing them, I was like, what makes a great presentation? And it was kind of like cricket. So there were some examples. But the second you ask, what's the worst presentation you've ever seen? You just get so loud and everyone's got their stories.
Exactly. So same deal. So that's my passion, encouraging people to learn this new set of tools, new set of behaviours. And one of the questions you asked me was, how do you create engaging workshops that participants rave about afterwards? Well, I'd just like to draw your attention to the conversation we've just had in the last 5 minutes. What did I do?
You asked me questions.
Exactly. And I asked you questions that had a purpose, that caused you to think deeply in a non-threatening way so that you can learn yourself. Because a teacher, a facilitator, can't teach anybody anything. All they can do is create the environment in which the learner learns.
It's so interesting because I think, and I know a lot of my listeners echo this as well, we've got a community on Facebook where we sort of talk about upcoming facilitation or things that have happened in the past. And I think we do put a lot of a pressure on ourselves to make sure that participants walk away with the outcomes. But part of all of this is doing what you said, is kind of not having that control and just being able to guide a process. That's the challenge.
Ultimately, whether it's a party at your home or whether it's a workshop you're facilitating or whether it's a learning experience you're creating, the ultimate responsibility is to manage positive energy. So if the energy is positive, people are engaged and they'll listen and they'll learn and they'll enjoy themselves. If you create negative energy, such as statements as opposed to questions, then people start to tune out.
I love that. Like I just wrote that down. So, because I've got this LinkedIn, on LinkedIn, you can write like your tagline and people are just creating all different, like, what their job title is, or it might be they help people to do this. I just love that. I'm a manager of positive energy.
Right.
That's pretty cool.
Wonderful.
I'll have to give you the attribution for that.
That's all right.
Hey, I like on your website, it says a person is more likely to change their mind when they don't have to. I thought that was really interesting and something, you've got it's quite prominent on your website. So how do you make this happen? Is it through your line of questioning that you do this, or like how do you make that switch so they think they're changing their mind? Okay.
I use a whole series of metaphors. One way, early in the workshop, I'll provide a number of participants with an empty vessel, namely a cup or a jug or a cup or a glass, and I'll get a beer jug full of water. And I use this in two ways. The first way is in relation to community building. And what I do there is I go around and I say to each person with their empty container, do you get anything out of belonging to this organisation? And they say yes. And I say, okay, this jug full of water represents this organisation and what it gives you, allow me to give you, right? And so I pour some water into their glass, okay? And I proceed to do that around the group until I get to a person and I go to pour the container water out of the jug and there's nothing left in it. And then I say to the assembled people, who's filling the jug?
Wow.
See, that's just a metaphor, but it's a visual metaphor and people understand it. Now, the other way I do it is I get the same jug of water and one glass, which I fill up with water, and I give it to somebody to hold, and I ask them to hold it over their lap. Then I hold up the jug and I say, this jug represents all of the combined knowledge of the people in the room. And this jug of water, this cup of water represents the wisdom that one person has brought into this room. I then give the jug to somebody else, sitting next to the person holding the glass, and say, would you please kindly pour the contents of the jug into that glass? In which case there is mirth and laughter and embarrassment and whatever, and people are reluctant to obey me, thank goodness, because I say, what's the point of, and I retrieve the full glass and ceremonially drink 3/4 of it deliberately to say, what's the point of being here if we do not leave room for other people's wisdom?
Oh my gosh. It's so powerful. God, I love these.
Yeah, so they're simple and they're effective.
These are all new concepts that I haven't seen explored, and I love how, I've got a leadership training thing on this week, and even you talking about the water, and because I think expect all leaders to do all certain things, but what's the team member accountability, and that kind of links in nicely to your water jug analogy. What inspires you? Like, when did you get that idea?
I've just got a crazy mind.
Have you got a book out? I know that you've contributed to the Story Cookbook, but you really need to get something out.
Yeah, I do have a book out, but it doesn't share any of these things in it. These are just tools that I use, but maybe I just take them for granted. I never there's another thing that I use when the subject matter is about the survival or even the learning for an individual or an organisation. And I offer them a metaphor there, which is attention grabbing. And it works particularly well with males, and I'll explain why in a moment, where I ask somebody, do you know how to catch? Well, I say, who's played cricket? Right? And someone will stick their hand up. I say, okay, do you know how to catch? And they say, yes. I say, okay, catch. And I reach into a container I have beside me, and I throw an object, which they catch, and it is a dead mullet.
What?
A wet, sticky fish. And then I ask them, what is it they're now holding? And they say, it's a fish. And I say, what sort of fish? And they say, a dead fish. I said, yes, and why is it dead? And it's a gutted fish, so it's got no intestines in it. And they say, it's out of water. And I say, yes, and why else is it dead? Because it doesn't have any internal mechanism for its own survival. And then I say, yes, so this fish is dead and it's no longer in the ocean. Does the ocean cry for the fish?
No.
To which the answer is no. So I say, therefore, whose responsibility is the survival of the fish? A, to maintain a fit with a constantly changing external environment, and B, to maintain an internal capability to deal with that constantly changing external environment. Whose responsibility is that?
It's the fish's responsibility.
Absolutely. Nobody else's. Nobody else cares. So it's brutal. It's effective. It's a message.
Wow, that is, oh gosh, there's a bit of effort into your packing the day of, like must find fish, must gut fish.
Yeah, all of that. Any workshop that I do, all the preparation is prior. The workshop itself is just the fun. It's novel for the participants, but I've got a reasonable idea, unless something completely unusual happens, I've got a reasonable idea how it's going to unfold and what they're going to learn.
Yeah, that fish example is a great example for locus of control as well. I sort of use locus of control in quite a few of my workshops, but nothing as dramatic as that. So there's a personal challenge for me to...
Well, let me raise a counter argument for doing it. Ethics. Do I have to take food stuff and use it to throw around the room?
Yeah. And so I guess you judge your audience you'd make sure that it suits that audience before.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed.
So how else do you prepare for like upcoming workshops? You said that preparation's like it's critical for you when you deliver. It's just you're having fun. How much sort of effort, what kind of things do you go through before you step into that workshop environment?
It depends on the workshop and what the objective is or the object of the workshop is. I mean, the word facilitation is Latin for to make things happen. That's all. And therefore, what sort of things do you want to make happen? Is it team building? Is it a strategic plan? Is it an effective conduct of a meeting to get through an agenda? Is it resolving a conflict? It can be any of those things, or running a conference. And in my experience, all of the cooperative conversation tools work perfectly in all of those settings. And they're about engagement, respect, mutuality, structured dialogue and decision making.
So before you had your cooperative conversations framework, do you ever sort of encounter situations and workshops where something uncomfortable happened or you weren't too sure how to navigate it? Something that really made you pause and reflect and think, why do I do this as a job? Because I think, all of our listeners, myself, have had that moment where something's gone wrong and you're trying to sort of create, like you said, manage that positive energy and bring it back up. Have you had a situation where things haven't unfolded the way that you thought it would?
Yes, I have. A couple of examples. The cooperative conversation tools are about equity, about equality of participation, about transparency. And I have run workshops where the senior executive don't like that because they're unable to manipulate the participants. So I'm not their favourite son in those settings. Another learning for me as a facilitator, and this wasn't my doing, but I had a co-facilitator on a residential workshop at a luxury resort, and the co-facilitator and the client was paying, including paying at the bar. So the co-facilitator got stuck into the grog and made a complete fool of himself. And out of that, I didn't change my behaviour because it was the way I behaved anyway, but out of that came the resolve, when you are with a client, you are always on duty. Always.
I completely agree with that one as well. Situation earlier this year, they invited me out for dinner and drinks, and I just thought, hang on, I'm being paid to actually do a good job with day 2. There's some things I learned from today. I'm going to go back to my hotel room and work on that. Even though I thought it was a nice opportunity to build the relationship, I think the reason why I was there was to deliver something great for them. So that's where I put my energy. It's a tough call though, because you're in these, like you said, really amazing locations. The people you're hanging out with are great. So it's very easy to be sort of swayed. On that note though, what is the best location that you've delivered a workshop at?
I've delivered workshops at a whole range of locations, some of which no longer exist, like Daydream Island or wherever. But I don't think the location per se is all that important. In some ways, it's a distraction. If the location is upmarket, then that signals that there's money to be splashed around. And for many clients, this is not what you want to have. So for my way of thinking, the characteristics of a good location are adequate lighting, adequate ventilation, appropriate audio visuals, fresh air, distractions from outside noise, including the white noise of air conditioners, by the way, that can dampen down. Facilitators might think that they've got a big, strong voice, but in a large room with soft furnishings, carpets and soft chair coverings, sound can get sucked up quite easily. So good audio visual. If I'm working with a group of more than 20, then I ask the client whether a lapel mic is possible, so that I'm not straining my voice all day and that the people can hear me comfortably.
I agree with you on that one. With regards to your energy levels, and again, going back to the point of managing positive energy, it can be sometimes very tiring as a facilitator at the end of 1, 2 days, 3 days. Have you delivered like 5 days on the go or extensive training, full days? And if so, how have you managed to sort of maintain your energy levels, and so you're still showing up and being that person that can maintain the energy for your group?
Yes, I've frequently done 5-day residential workshops where I'm the sole or at least the major presenter, or conferences similarly. And this, I'll attribute this comment not to me but to my mentor and dear friend Bob Dick, who's one of Australia's best facilitators by far. And Bob says that with respect to energy, it's counter-cyclical. He said, when the participant's energy is low, yours needs to be up. When theirs is up, you can afford to have yours down.
Again, I'm writing that down. So I had Bob Dick on the show, one of the early episodes, and I didn't ask him that question. Yeah, that makes sense. So you've actually, it's kind of like not even a marathon, because in a marathon you're doing a steady pace, but it's more about noticing what's going on, being able to self-regulate. And it's also really good that you don't have to be 100% energetic the whole day.
No, that's right. And there's the natural energy cycle in the room. Afternoons are harder than mornings. Afternoon tea and after that is particularly difficult, and any nutritionists who are listening will shudder at this, but a sugar hit at afternoon tea helps. So fresh fruit, jubes, lollies, that's when people are looking for energy. If their mental engagement is still high, but their physical energy is low. And bear in mind that as facilitators, our energy is more likely to be higher than the participants who are sitting most of the time and engaging in concentrated mental work at a different level of intensity than they most normally do. So we need to bear that in mind and help them manage their level of energy.
Yeah, particularly I run workshops with people that do a lot of like labour tasks. So they're out, driving trucks or supervising shifts on mines. And so they find it extremely tiring after a day of sort of sitting there.
I do indeed. It's that level of mental intensity for people who are more inclined to be out and about and moving. And it is the case that our brain consumes 20 times more energy than our muscles. Unless we feed it, it's no surprise that people get tired.
I didn't know that stat. Hey, so let's just say that you're talking to a younger version of Ian. You're talking to the 40-year-old Ian that sort of stepped out of his psych degree and started teaching.
Yeah.
What's some advice that you'd give to your younger self when it comes to facilitation? And I guess the reason I ask this question is, what advice would you give our listeners that are first-time facilitators?
That's a very good question, because it's an intergenerational question, and it also bounces back to your second question, what's the biggest challenge in 2019 for me? And they're related, because the answer is social media. And I'm a dinosaur when it comes to social media. And so the methods that people use to be seen, to be heard, to attract attention, such as this podcast. I had to ask you, what's a podcast? I've never done a podcast.
Now you can say you have.
Now I can say I have. So I think it's to use whatever is contemporary as your sort of primary vehicle for becoming known. I think once you get to there, though, the skills are the same. That once you get down to dealing with people and you're face-to-face with people, or you're creating e-learning environments even, the skills are the same. And they are, how do you create a situation that manages people's energy in a positive, equitable way that enthuses them, interests them, and makes them keen to learn and remember?
Yeah, I could not agree more. I ran a recent Train the Technical Trainer session, and I said, look, most of the techniques I'm teaching you today are face-to-face, but we're going to, as a group, collectively figure out how do we take this example and simulate it in an online environment.
Great.
Yeah, and got some great ideas from the group, because I was very tempted to be like, hey, this is how you do it. And then I okay, Leanne, remember what you're there to do. Generate that group discussion.
Draft and the breeze. They've got the answers. They'll know.
Oh, I love it. Yeah.
If you ask them the right question and you just keep the conversation going, so keep layering ideas into the middle of the table and don't respond to any of them saying, yes, I like that idea. I mean, that sounds crazy. Last week I was running a little workshop at the University of Queensland, and I suggested that if person A says something that person B agrees with, please don't say so. And they said, why not? And I said, because person C will be listening to see whether your response to them is as warm and supportive as it was to person B. So all of a sudden you have unconscious politics at play, which you want to avoid.
Wow, and I've noticed it as well when a facilitator will say, hey, that's a great question, but then they haven't said that to the other 4 questions that were asked. So then those other 4 people think, well, maybe my question wasn't so good.
Indeed.
Yeah, and then that person C will be thinking, oh, I don't want to ask a question that's not great, so I won't put up my hand. Oh, gosh, there's so much to think about in terms of group dynamics. It's such a fascinating space.
So my suggestion would just say to each person, if they give you a question, thank you for the question. So treat them equally, and if that sounds like a broken record, just say thanks.
Cheers.
Well, for me, cheers it's more contemporary. For my generation, it's less sincere than thanks.
Oh, good. That's good to know. Ian, if you've got any listeners that would love to reach out to you, find out more about Cooperative Conversations, and also find out more about the PhD that you did on incompetent organisations, I'm keen to hear more about that as well. Where can they find you?
My website is www.cooperativeconversations, one word, no hyphen in cooperative.com.au, or you can find me on LinkedIn.
Wonderful. Ian, thank you so much. I'm so grateful that we got to have this conversation on the podcast. I just love the different methodologies that you threw out and the way that you really think about the way groups operate, and some really interesting approaches to getting conversations not talking to each other. It's so different to any other guests that we've had on. So I really appreciate you bringing on those insights.
Thank you very much, Leanne. It's a pleasure being on your podcast. Thanks for inviting me. Another new experience. May I continue to have them, and so may you.
Thank you.
If I can be of any support whatsoever to any of your listeners, I'm only too happy to help. Just drop me an email and I'll share whatever resources I have.
Awesome. And we'll link all of Ian's details, including LinkedIn and his website, in the show notes for this episode. Thanks again, Ian.
Thank you, Leanne.
Hey, thanks so much for sticking around. You've reached the end of another episode of the First Time Facilitator podcast. Connect with the show at firsttimefacilitator.com or follow me on Instagram at Leanne Hughes to find out what I'm up to during the week. If you enjoyed this episode, please feel free to share it with someone who will also appreciate the insight, and make it easier for yourself and subscribe to the show in your podcast player of choice. Thank you so much for listening, and chat to you next week.